How's it going, everyone? We've made it to chapter 4. So far, you've modeled and cleaned up a solid game ready prop, which honestly you should be super proud of. So, in this lesson, we're going to discuss a process called unwrapping, which is an essential step that allows us to apply materials and textures in a nice, clean, accurate way onto our lovely crate. So, what is unwrapping? Unwrapping is a process where we are taking our 3D meshes and flattening them down onto a 2D surface. So, as an example, imagine you have a cardboard cube. So, I'm going to draw, let's say, there we go. So, this is my cardboard cube that you're imagining. So, this cube is a 3D object. There's a total of 6 faces, all the good stuff that we expect. So now if I took a scissors and I start cutting along some of the edges of the cube. So maybe I'm going to make a cut there. Maybe I'll cut here. Maybe I'll cut here. And with enough cuts, this face over here becomes a little bit loose. And I could peel this face down and lay it right on the ground, flatten it, press it out. And then I can continue this process by making more cuts. Maybe I'll cut some edges here so I could peel this one down, lay it flat. Maybe I'll do the same for this face on the side, lay it flat. And for this face in the back and this one on the top, these are like the only two faces that are left, and they're connected to each other. So I could flatten the back one over here on the ground, and then the top face will follow right behind. Now, this is a pretty messy drawing, but if you take that 3D cube and you lay it all the way down, we're going to essentially get a shape that looks something like this. There we go. And this is a 2D surface. So in Blender terminology, that process of me turning this 3D object into a flattened 2D one is called unwrapping. And all of these cuts that I made here, these are called seams. Now, because I ended up with a 2D object, Blender likes to put these on an axis. And the horizontal axis is called U, and the other dimension, so the vertical axis, is called V. And this is where the idea of the name UV unwrapping comes from. So later on, I can then paint on the surface of this flattened cardboard cube. When I'm done painting on it, I could fold it back up into this 3D mesh, and now I have a painted / textured 3D object. And this is what's going to give us the final polished look of whatever design we are trying to achieve. So, where does this process all happen? So, let's take a cube as an example. Let's actually hide this and bring in an example cube. So this is the cube that we've imagined. With an object selected, we're going to head over to the UV editing workspace right here at the top. And immediately we're greeted by two editors that are split screened. On the left, we have the UV editor. This editor allows us to preview those 2D surfaces. And this grid space here is essentially our UV grid. So our UV grid. And in this grid space in the back, this is where our image texture is going to go. And that image texture is going to act like the painted / textured material that we want to display onto the faces of our mesh. And on the right area, we have our 3D viewport with our selected object automatically in edit mode. So you could see that whenever we select the face, so with A, all of these faces are selected, I get the 6 faces here. However, if I remove it, well, I have no faces selected, nothing appears here. If I select one, Let's go to face select mode. Select the face, it'll show up. If I select multiple faces, it'll honestly show up. But honestly, this is a little bit annoying. It would be nicer if we had a way to automatically display all of these faces at once, even when they're not selected. And then if I select specifically one of the faces, it'll show up highlighted. Now, there's actually a way that you could do this in Blender. So in the UV Editor tab, this dual arrow icon called UV Sync Selection does that work for us. So when we select it, the 2D version is always previewed. And if we select a face in either editor, it's going to show up highlighted in both editors. Now, one thing I've noticed is that this is a cube that we're dealing with here. So this design that we have already is very similar to the one that we discussed when we were imagining that example. Now, this is because that a cube is one of the more simpler 3D objects, so Blender already knows how to unwrap this pretty well. But again, if you imagine, even with our crate or in future meshes, if you have tens or hundreds of faces, you're not exactly going to get a result that you're happy with right off the bat. So hence some work needs to be made. Anyways, I've used the terminology 2D version a lot. So yes, it's 2D version because it's the flattened 2D version of our 3D object. But specifically in Blender, a set of connected faces are called UV islands. Now, if I had two separate sets of connected faces here, so let's say if I took this face and imagine it was detached, I'll just place it over here. Now I have two islands. This one by itself, and this T-shaped here is my second island. Okay, let's just undo that to get it back. Specifically in the editor itself, a lot of the buttons that we see are very similar to ones that we've seen in other workspaces, mainly the 3D viewport. You have a little bit of more niche options here, but we also have some options on the top that allow us to create and open images, which are going to be very helpful to preview the design in our mesh later on. As a small example, if you imagine that I had an image here, and this image shows up on this background, and let's say on that image, I had like a smiley face right here, for instance. Because the smiley face is over this face, and this face corresponds to this face of my 3D object, I would imagine that when I wrap it back up into this 3D object, I will actually have a smiley face right here. Now, the orientation of these faces will matter in the future. So for instance, if I select this edge, I could see that this edge, even though it's the top here, it actually corresponds to this side edge over here. So in reality, to make this example a bit more realistic, my smiley face is actually going to end up looking like this. Okay, but the discussion about rotation and location and all that transformation stuff, we'll see a little bit more of it as we move on. So, that was the general process of the default behavior of what Blender gives us already. So how exactly do we unwrap ourselves? Let's make a little bit of space here. So in Blender, to unwrap an object, we select the desired faces that we want to unwrap. This is typically one or more meshes. In this case, it's my entire cube. So I'm going to select the entire cube with A. And in my 3D viewport, I'm going to head over to the UV tab and select Unwrap. And the Unwrap version is going to show up in my UV editor. Now we got a result that's very similar to the previous version because we haven't placed any seams on our mesh. So Blender is still doing that guesswork for how to cut our mesh, but it's doing the same guesswork that it did to give us the first version. So what about placing seams? How do we do that? Placing seams happens in the 3D viewport in edit mode. So you can use this split screen area, or you can go back to layout and go into edit mode if you want like to have a full screen workspace. Now because the cuts are made along these edges, we want to be in edge select mode. And whenever we select an edge, we can click this edge button, which shortcut is Control E, and we're looking for the option mark seam. When we select Mark Seam, that edge becomes red, indicating that this edge has a seam placed onto it, and hence telling Blender that make sure to cut this edge when you unwrap. If you accidentally place the seam, in that same drop-down menu, right below it, you have a clear seam option, and it's going to go away. And of course, you can select multiple seams, multiple edges, mark seam to do it all at once, and it's the same process for clearing multiple seams. So, to show a little bit more about how this process works, let's say that we mark seams around this top face over here. So I already have 3 down. Let's make a 4th one here. So in other words, right now, we are telling Blender to cut this face out. If you cut all 4 sides away from a face, it's going to detach it from the rest of the mesh. Now, in the remaining 5 faces, which honestly now looks like a box with no lid, because this is now a separate face, let us further go along the walls of that box. Let's make some cuts there. So, with these seams placed, we would expect, well, what are we going to expect in our UV editor? Well, this is a box with no lid, so here's the lid. It's just that square face. And these 5 connected faces on the bottom face is going to lie down like this. And then the walls are going to flatten out into this flower or plus sign looking shape. So before we see what the unwrapping actually looks like, we are expecting 2 standalone islands, just like this. So let's verify that. If we go back to edit mode, like this, if I select all these faces, so we'll do it in face select mode, select everything, go to UV, unwrap, this is the result that we get. So don't worry too much about the location, rotation, or scale of anything of this, what shows up in our UV editor. What's important is that we have control about how to control what each of the islands are going to look like. Now let's say by chance if I remove all of these seams over here, so I'm going to press clear seam. Let's see what happens if I try to do this process again. I press unwrap, Blender gives me this warning. And this is essentially saying that Blender cannot do any more guesswork here. It's saying, help me place seams so I can figure this out. And of course, if you do it in a way that no longer makes any sense, so let's say if I only added 1 seam. So on this edge, I'm going to press mark seam. We know adding 1 seam isn't going to do anything because none of the faces are actually going to be able to peel out from each other. It's just going to be like a box with a hole on one of the sides. Either way, this is not going to make sense. So if we try to go back and unwrap this, Blender's going to give us something very unsatisfactory in return. Okay, but if we go back and do it the right way, so let's say these edges will peel this face off, then we could peel this face off on the side, and then this face off on the side, and the rest would be able to be easily flattened. So this is an example of what correct seams would look like. And if I try to unwrap this version, it's going to give me a good result. Okay, so even though Blender initially did proper guesswork for us off the bat, if you place seams and tinker with it, Blender is going to start updating its guesswork based on your behavior. So even though it got it right the first time, it doesn't mean it's going to get it right later on, even if it looks exactly the same. Okay, now there's another common method to unwrap, which is the Smart UV Project option. So Smart UV Project, if I click it, this allows us to cut our mesh based on this angle threshold, allowing us to have somewhat of a control over how automatic seams are going to be placed onto this mesh that I have here. So this is typically used sometimes for simple objects, but a lot of people might use this for more complicated objects just to save time. Now there is an algorithm that Blender's using behind the scenes that figures out all of this information out, but it's honestly a little tough to understand precisely, even for me. And I often just see myself just sticking with these default settings. but we can click OK and see what the result gives me. So in an example like this, for more complicated shapes, when you click OK, something will happen for more complicated shapes. It didn't really do much for this version because the Smart UV Project and the manual unwrap for manual seams placed like this are actually identical. But in more complicated options, the best thing that I like to do is click OK, see what happens, and if I know any funny business that's going on here, I can note it down, and then in those problem areas, I can go back and place more seams where necessary. Now, specifically, the only option from the Smart Project that I like is this island margin. Let me highlight the cube first. Go to Smart. And I like to put this to a very small number like 0.01. What this island margin says is that it's going to separate all of the faces onto their own separate islands that are being separated by this marginal value. So if I press OK, you can see this is what's happening. Here are my 6 faces, and if I zoom in, there's a little gap between them. And that gap is that 0.01 meter marginal value. Now, the result of this gives us something that doesn't really make a lot of sense to us, especially when we revised what a good unwrapping of a cube looks like. This tells you that when you're going down the Smart UV Project route with island margins, it's typically for if you want all of your faces to be distinct. You know, you don't have a continuous texture applying from one face to the next. So if they're all distinct, or if they're all just a very solid color, then rotation and continuity doesn't really matter in this case. So that might be a good example for why you might use this. But in general, it is still a great skill for both beginners and even professionals to understand how to logically create an unwrapping the manual way. So when you do use some of these shortcut options, you can understand a little bit about what is happening. And when you start dealing with more complicated designs and more complicated textures, you could then start to combine your workflow with the Smart UV Project to look for ways to improve your workflow. Anyways, let's head back out to the layout workspace. We're going to delete this cube and all of this mess that we've made, like this, even in, nope, there's no more in edit mode. So we will delete this cube, and we're going to bring back our crate. So if we look at our crate a little bit, it is true that we do have some more intricate shapes going on here. And we also got some duplicated shapes from the mirror modifier. So when we want to start thinking about placing seams all over this crate, especially for the ones with the mirror modifiers like these ones, it'll be a lot easier if we had something more consistent. So if you're thinking at this point in time, you're like, Dylan, why did you make us confirm all of the mirror modifiers? Wouldn't it have been just a lot easier to put all the seams on one mesh? And then therefore, when we use the mirror modifier, it's going to automatically do it to all of them. And I would look at you, take a step back and say, you know what, you're right. And if you're making observations like this at this stage, honestly, I have to congratulate you a little bit because you're already starting to think about ways to improve your workflow. Honestly, that's amazing. Now, for the rest of us, if you're thinking, yeah, that's probably a good idea, hopefully, through the tedious process of going back and setting up those mirrors and then making seams, that tedious process is going to take some sort of effect on you, and it's going to make you realize that you don't want to do this mistake again. So kind of what I did here was on purpose, only because sometimes I think it's better that you experience something tedious. So if you encounter that situation again, you're going to be like, no way, I'd never want to do that again. And you're going to remember a good workflow. That aside, not all hope is lost yet. I say before we start jumping the gun and start putting seams everywhere, let's actually try to take the crate as it is and let Blender try to unwrap it. See what it's able to figure out, and if anything needs some guidance, we're going to note that down to make our seam work a little bit easier. So, with only the crate visible, press A to select everything, and make sure everything that's not related to the crate is hidden. So I don't want my reference to be visible, don't want my axes to be visible. Actually, I'll take away my axes first because they're still selected here. Take away that first. If you have any backup meshes, remove that as well. All right, I'll press A. And just remember, if you press A and everything is in this dark blue selection, remember to control select something. Otherwise, when you go into UV editing, you're actually not going to be able to enter that edit mode. So at least one of these meshes have to be this light blue color. And yeah, let's go back to that UV editing. So this is just the temporary work that Blender's been doing behind the scenes. That's not important to us because we're going to press A to select all of this, UV, unwrap. And this is the result that we're going to get. So we've got quite a bit of islands going on here. So at this point in time, I'll go through each part of my mesh, see what's good, see what's not good, and just note them down. And I'll use my outliner to just make sure I see everything one by one. Okay, so the first thing is the walls. Let's check the walls. So if I look at my walls plane, remember I could press L to link select. So I could link select the wall. Let's go in face select mode first. There we go. And it looks like this here constitutes to my plane wall. So right off the bat, I already see that this is a very funky looking shape. Another thing that catches my eye is that in a proper unwrap, we expect that the unwrapping to be this nice gray translucent color. This means that this is the only island, not the only island, the only face that is occupying the space in the grid. When you start to have gray areas that are a little bit more opaque, this means that you have some overlapping that's going on here. And I could prove that by selecting a face with some gray area like this one, and if I try to move it away, it's going to reveal more faces behind it. So that's going to be a problem. So it's going to be a problem, and hence some seams around this area for this wall is probably going to be made. If I start checking other areas, let's say the vented wall, same thing. Funky looking shape, got a couple of opaque behaviors going on here. And honestly, at this point, I'm starting to think about it's faster to see what might have worked instead of what didn't work. So just scanning around, checking about everything. These, for the most part, look good, but then a lot of my faces in the middle are very tiny. So having too small of a faces is also not very good as well, because if you have more complicated textures, when we discuss about that topic a little bit later, it's actually not going to pick a lot of it up. Either way, we have a little bit of opaque behavior. So funky business everywhere. These ones look pretty good. So if I press L, what does this refer to? Okay, so it's actually the screw. So the screws here actually look pretty good. And if I zoom out a little bit, so I got some screws here. So all the screws seem to be unwrapped pretty well. Even this looks pretty good. So I'm guessing this is a corner because it looks like a cube shape. So yep, this one constitutes to the corner, and the corners also look pretty well unwrapped. But everything else doesn't, which is a little bit of an unfortunate news. Honestly, I was hoping that there are a lot more good ones, but this is the process of why we scan through and take notes. Either way, I hope this visual alone of what's going on in this UV editor is enough to convince you of why good seams are important for a good unwrapping. In that case, because there is a lot of work here, I think it's best if we take a short transition, take a small break to just collect and prepare yourself for what's to come, because in the next lesson, we're going to be talking about ways to troubleshoot all the problems that we're finding with these UVs. All right, don't worry too much about it. The end is near. We already got a nice crate to deal with, but I just want to advise you to keep your head up high, and I can't wait to see you in the next lesson. Take care.